The crack of the wagon wheel splitting clean in two was the loneliest sound Esther Ellsworth had ever heard, and she had heard quite a few lonely sounds in her 26 years of living. The sun had already begun its long, slow descent behind the red rock ridges of the Arizona Territory, painting the sky in shades of burnt amber and deep violet, and Esther sat on the buckboard of her disabled wagon with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the ruined wheel with the particular calm of a woman who has survived enough disasters to know that panic solves nothing. The rear left wheel had given out somewhere between the shallow creek crossing and the dry stretch of road that led toward the town of Millhaven, and now the wagon listed badly to one side, its cargo of fabric bolts, sewing supplies, 2 crates of household goods, and 1 very small wooden chest of her late mother's jewelry, all tilted at an uncomfortable angle. She climbed down from the buckboard and walked around to assess the damage properly. The wheel's wooden spoke had cracked through from the rim to the hub, and the iron tire had come away from the felloe on one side. It was not a small repair. It was not the kind of thing she could fix herself, not with the tools she carried, not with the light fading fast and no town in sight. Esther pressed her lips together and looked up the road in both directions. Nothing in either direction but red earth, sage brush, and the distant silhouette of a hawk riding thermals in the cooling air. She had been traveling from Tucson, heading north toward Millhaven, where her late husband's cousin had offered her a position helping run the general store. Her husband, Thomas Ellsworth, had died 14 months prior of a fever that swept through their small homestead south of Tucson and took him in 4 days flat. She had buried him under the cottonwood tree he had planted the year they married, and she had spent the following year settling his debts, selling the land, and figuring out what a woman of 26 with no children and no close family did with the rest of her life. The answer, apparently, was to get her wagon wheel cracked on a desolate stretch of Arizona Territory road at sunset. She unhitched her mule, old Barnabas, and tied him to a creosote bush where he could graze on what little dry grass grew there. Then she climbed back onto the buckboard, retrieved her rifle from beneath the seat, checked that it was loaded, and settled in to wait. She did not know what she was waiting for exactly, but she had learned from her father, a practical man from Ohio who had moved the family west when she was 12, that waiting in a place where someone might come was always better than wandering into a place where no one would look for you. She had been sitting there for perhaps 40 minutes, watching the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky overhead, when she heard the sound of hooves on the hard-packed road. Not the thunder of a rushing horse, but the easy, unhurried rhythm of a horse being walked by a rider who was in no particular hurry and felt no need to be. She brought the rifle across her lap, not raised, but positioned. Just in case. The rider came around the slight bend in the road and slowed when he saw the wagon. He was on a dark bay horse, broad-shouldered animal with good legs, and the rider himself sat in the saddle the way men who have spent most of their life on horseback sit, easy and loose, like the horse was simply an extension of him. He wore a worn brown hat with a dark band, a canvas duster that had seen serious weather, and his face, when he was close enough for her to make it out in the dimming light, was square-jawed and sun-darkened, with a few days' worth of stubble and eyes she could not quite make out the color of yet. He stopped the horse a respectful distance away. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste words. "Evening," Esther replied, keeping her tone neutral and her rifle visible. He glanced at the rifle, then at the tilted wagon, then back at her. If he was offended by the rifle, he gave no sign of it. "Looks like you've had some trouble," he said. "Rear wheel," she said. Spoke gave out. He swung down from the horse in one smooth motion and wrapped the reins around the pommel, then walked toward the wagon, keeping his movements deliberate and slow, the kind of movements that said he understood why a woman alone on a dark road might want to keep a rifle handy. He crouched beside the damaged wheel and studied it for a long moment, running his fingers along the split spoke and the separated iron tire. "Spokes cracked through," he said, "and the tires pulled away on this side." "I know," she said. He looked up at her. Even in the fading light she could see that his eyes were a shade of gray-green, like sage after rain. He was perhaps 30, maybe 31, with the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and work into something that was not pretty exactly but was solid and honest-looking. "I've got tools in my saddlebag," he said. "Spare spoke, some iron banding, a draw knife. I can fix this." Esther looked at him for a moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Perry Easton," he said. "I ride for the Harlan Outfit cattle ranch about 12 miles north of Millhaven. I'm heading back from Tucson." He paused. "I'm not going to ask you to trust me because I'm a stranger and trust ought to be earned. But I will tell you that I can't in good conscience ride on and leave a woman stranded on this road in the dark, so I'll fix the wheel whether you keep that rifle pointed at me or not." Esther studied him for another moment. There was something in his manner, the careful way he had approached, the way he had announced his intentions rather than simply acting on them, the way his eyes had gone straight to the wheel rather than to her in any unsettling way, that told her more than a letter of introduction might have. She set the rifle back under the seat. "Esther Ellsworth," she said. "I'm obliged to you, Mr. Easton." "Perry's fine," he said, and went to his horse to begin unpacking his saddlebags. What followed was something Esther had not expected, though in hindsight she would recognize it as the beginning of everything. Perry Easton worked on that wheel with a focus and competence that was genuinely impressive to watch. He had clearly done this kind of work before, and he talked her through what he was doing, not in a patronizing way but in the natural way of a man who thought out loud when he worked. He had a wooden spare spoke in his saddlebag, which was unusual enough that she asked him about it. "My mother traveled out here from Missouri in a wagon train when I was 7, he said, fitting the new spoke against the hub and testing the angle. "Wheel trouble stranded us 3 times in one summer. She made me carry a spare spoke ever since. Even after I stopped driving wagons, I kept the habit. She passed 4 years ago, but I never stopped carrying it." "That's a remarkable thing," Esther said. She had climbed down from the buckboard and stood a few feet away, holding the lantern she had lit from her supplies so he could see what he was doing. Perry glanced at her briefly. "She was a remarkable woman," he said simply, and went back to his work. The night deepened around them. The desert air cooled quickly once the sun went down, and Esther retrieved her wool shawl from inside the wagon and wrapped it around her shoulders. The stars above the Arizona Territory were extraordinary, thick and bright in a way that eastern skies never quite managed, and she had never entirely gotten used to them even after 14 years in the West. Perry worked steadily, methodically, replacing the broken spoke and working the iron tire back onto the rim using the draw knife, and a piece of flat iron he heated briefly in a small fire he built beside the road. The work required patience. It required knowing what you were doing. And it required the willingness to keep at it through the hours when everything in a man's body would rather be sleeping. Somewhere around 10 o'clock, Esther decided that the least she could do was make use of her camp supplies. She set up her small iron camp pot over the fire Perry had built and made coffee from her tin of grounds, and she fried some salt pork in the pan and heated beans she had been carrying since morning. "You don't have to feed me," Perry said, looking up from his work. "You don't have to fix my wheel," she replied. "But here we are." He held her gaze for a moment, and then something happened at the corners of his mouth, a very small thing, barely a movement at all, but it was the beginning of a smile. "Here we are," he agreed. They ate together at the fireside, the wagon wheel half repaired behind them, the desert enormous and quiet around them, and they talked. It began with practical things, as conversations between strangers often do. She told him about her late husband, mentioned it plainly without drama, the way a person mentions a hard fact they have made their peace with. He listened without offering hollow comfort, which she appreciated more than she could easily explain. She told him she was heading to Millhaven to work in her late husband's cousin Harold Ellsworth's general store. that she had some skill with a needle and thread, and planned to offer alterations and dressmaking on the side. Perry told her that he had been with the Harlan outfit for 6 years, that he was a foreman now though he had started as a line rider, and that cattle work suited him in a way that nothing else quite had. He had tried other things. He had worked a mine outside of Bisbee for 3 months and hated every minute of it. He had driven a freight wagon for a season, which was what had taught him to keep a spare wheel spoke. "Have you always been in Arizona territory?" she asked. "No," he said. "Born in Kansas. Came west at 7 with my family, like I said. My father thought there was farmland to be had in New Mexico, but the soil didn't agree with him. We drifted south and west. My father's still got a small place outside of Prescott. My brother runs cattle down near the Mexican border. A family of wanderers," she said. "Most everyone out here is," he said, "including you." She looked at the fire. "I suppose that's true." After they ate, Perry went back to the wheel and she washed the tin plates and coffee cups with a little water from her canteen and sat again with the lantern. And they continued talking in the way that people talk when the night is long and the silence is comfortable and there is no particular reason to stop. He told her about a cattle drive he had been on 2 years before, up through New Mexico into Colorado, the kind of story that had dust and lightning and ornery longhorns and a river crossing that went wrong, and he told it well, with dry humor at his own expense. She laughed in spite of herself at the image of him trying to coax 300 cattle across a flooded creek on a horse that was as reluctant as the cattle. "The horse and I had a disagreement about strategy," he said gravely. "And who won?" "The river," he said, and she laughed again. She told him about growing up in Ohio before her father moved the family west, about the way the seasons changed there in ways that the Arizona territory simply never did, and how she still sometimes missed the particular green of an Ohio summer, even though she had not lived there since she was 12 and was now more Western than anything else. She told him about her late mother, who had died of pneumonia on the trail west and was buried in a grave marked only by a pile of stones somewhere in what would become Oklahoma territory. She told him this quietly and without self-pity, but Perry stopped what he was doing for a moment and looked at her with that gray-green gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, just that, not filling the space with other words. "Thank you," she said. She would have loved this country, I think. She liked big sky. Perry looked up at the blaze of stars above them. "Plenty of that," he said. "Plenty of that," she agreed. He worked through the night. That was the thing she would always remember first when she thought about that night, the sheer stubbornness of his commitment to finishing what he had started. There were moments when the repair was difficult, when the iron was not cooperating or the spoke needed more adjustment, and she could see the effort in the set of his shoulders and the way he paused to flex his hands, but he never suggested leaving it until morning, and he never complained. At some point past midnight, she fell asleep sitting up against the wagon wheel, the lantern dimming beside her, and she woke to find that someone, Perry, had draped a horse blanket over her shoulders without waking her. She looked up and found him still working on the opposite side of the wheel, his face lit by the small fire, entirely focused on what he was doing. She watched him for a moment before he noticed she was awake. There was something in his face in that unguarded moment, something concentrated and earnest, the face of a man who had decided to do something and was going to do it properly regardless of what the hour said. She found it, in a way she had not expected and could not immediately account for, very moving. "You should rest," she said. He glanced at her. "Nearly done," he said. "Another hour, maybe less." "Perry," she said, and the use of his given name, the first time she had used it, made him look at her more directly. "You have been at this for hours. You do not need to finish tonight." "If I leave it unfinished, the wheel's still no good," he said reasonably. "And you be stranded here come morning, that's not acceptable." She stared at him. "Not acceptable to whom?" He considered this briefly. "To me," he said, and went back to work. Esther pulled the horse blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, and she thought about Thomas, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of honest reflection. Thomas had been a decent man. He had not been unkind. But she did not think that Thomas would have spent a night mending a stranger's wagon wheel by a desert roadside, driven by the simple conviction that leaving someone stranded was not acceptable. Thomas would have assessed the cost and effort and found some reason why morning would be soon enough. She was not being unkind to his memory. She was simply being honest, the way that grief, when it has had enough time, allows you to be honest. At some point past 1 in the morning, Perry straightened up from the wheel, rolled his shoulders, and said, "Done." Esther got to her feet, letting the horse blanket fall, and went around to look. The wheel looked solid and true. The new spoke was set properly into the hub, and the iron tire was seated back on the rim. He had cleaned up his work well. "Can I test it?" she asked. "Go ahead." She tried to rock the wheel by hand. It was firm and steady. She looked up at him. He was standing back, watching her test his work with the quiet attention of a craftsman waiting for honest judgment. His face was tired. She could see that clearly in the firelight, but his eyes were alert and present. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it in a way that went considerably deeper than the words themselves. "You're welcome, Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. "Esther," she said. And because the night had been what it had been, long and honest and full of conversation that had gone well beyond polite strangers, she said it simply and directly, the way she meant it. "Please call me Esther." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she did not look away. "Esther," he said, and the way he said her name, careful and quiet, like something he was deciding to keep, made a warmth move through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They broke camp together in the pre-dawn dark. Perry doused the fire properly, and Esther packed her camp supplies and re-hitched old Barnabas, who regarded the whole business with the regal indifference of a mule who had seen worse. Perry saddled his dark bay, whose name turned out to be Solomon, and they set off down the road toward Millhaven together, since it was the same direction for both of them. The sky began to lighten to the east, going from black to deep blue to a strip of brilliant coral pink along the horizon, and the desert around them woke up in its quiet way, a cactus wren calling somewhere, the distant bark of a coyote finishing its night's business, the smell of sage coming up sharp and clean in the cooling air. They rode side by side, her on the buckboard and him on Solomon, and the conversation continued with the natural ease of people who have spent a night talking and have discovered that they are, against the odds of circumstance, genuinely interested in each other. He asked about her dressmaking, and she told him more about it, about the way fabric had always made sense to her in a way that a lot of things hadn't, about how her mother had taught her to sew before she died, and how she had kept teaching herself afterward. "There's something about making a thing with your hands," she said. "Something that lasts, even if it's only a dress." "I understand that," Perry said, and from the way he said it she could tell he genuinely did. They rode into Millhaven as the morning sun cleared the eastern ridgeline and laid long gold light across the dusty Main Street. Millhaven was a modest town, as Arizona Territory towns went in 1878, with a main street of about a dozen buildings including the general store, a livery, a hotel, a saloon, a dry goods establishment, a smithy, and a small church at the far end. It had the look of a place that had decided to be permanent, unlike some of the rougher camps that came and went with the mining or the cattle, and it was still early enough that the street was mostly quiet, just a few horses at the hitching posts and a man sweeping the porch of the hotel. Perry brought Solomon to a halt in front of Harold Ellsworth's general store, which had a painted sign and a display window showing bolts of cloth and canned goods. He swung down and came to help her with the mule, and she let him, climbing down from the buckboard while he held Barnabas's head. "Will you be all right from here?" he asked. "I will," she said. She looked at him in the full morning light, which was different from the firelight and the starlight of the night before. He was, she thought, a genuinely good-looking man in a weathered, honest way, but that was not what had hold of her attention. It was the eyes. The gray-green, steady, attentive eyes that had never once, through that entire long night, made her feel like anything other than a person deserving of respect and help. "Thank you," she said again. for all of it. He held his hat in both hands, which was a telling thing, though she did not know yet that it was the thing he did when he was uncertain and trying to behave correctly. "It was my pleasure," he said. "And I mean that, ma'am, Esther. I hope I'll see you again," she said, and she said it because it was true and because she had decided years ago that there was no sense in pretending otherwise when something was true. He looked at her with those steady eyes, and something moved in them, something she could see clearly even from where she was standing. "Millhaven's my nearest town," he said. "I come in most Saturdays for supplies, and sometimes Sundays for the service." He glanced at the church at the end of the street. "Then I will see you most Saturdays," she said, and the small, slow smile he gave her in return, the full version of the thing she had seen beginning the night before, was something she held onto through the hours that followed. He mounted Solomon, put his hat back on, touched the brim to her, and rode up the street toward the livery. Esther stood in front of Harold Ellsworth's general store in the morning light and watched him go, and Barnabas the mule turned his long face toward her with an expression of profound equine disapproval, and she said quietly to the mule, "Oh, hush," and went to knock on the door of the store. Harold Ellsworth was a broad, cheerful man of about 40 with the good nature of someone who genuinely liked his work and his town. He had his late cousin Thomas's coloring, dark hair going gray, but none of Thomas's tendency toward worry. He showed Esther to the small but clean rooms above the store where she would live, helped her bring in her wagon cargo, and by the time they had talked through the arrangement for the next half hour, Esther had decided that Millhaven might work out rather better than she had hoped. She set up her sewing corner in the back of the general store that first week, a small table and chair near the window where the light was good, and by the end of her second day in Millhaven, she had taken in 3 alterations jobs from women who had seen her notice in the store window. By the end of the first week, she had repaired a split seam in the minister's good coat and made friends with Grace Holloway, the wife of the town's blacksmith, who was a frank, energetic woman of 30 who seemed to know everyone in the territory and had opinions about all of them. "You're the woman Perry Easton helped on the road," Grace said, the second time she came into the store. She said it with the precision of a woman who had been told this fact and was now examining Esther to assess its significance. "Word travels," Esther said, threading a needle. "Millhaven's a small town," Grace said serenely. "Perry's a good man, one of the best. He helped my husband haul timber last winter when Dan's back went out, never asked for a dime." "He seems very capable," Esther said, keeping her voice carefully even. Grace looked at her sidelong. "He's not married," she offered in the casual tone of a woman mentioning the weather. "I did not ask," Esther said. "No," Grace agreed. "But you were going to." Esther set down her sewing and looked at Grace directly. "You're very direct." "Saves time," Grace said cheerfully. "He comes in Saturdays for supplies." "He mentioned that," Esther said. Grace's smile widened. "Good," she said, and changed the subject so gracefully that Esther barely registered the shift. Saturday came, and with it the particular anxious busyness of a woman who was pretending she was not watching the door. She had 2 alterations to finish, and she focused on them with great determination, and only glanced at the door perhaps 8 or 9 times per hour, which she felt was quite restrained under the circumstances. Perry came in at mid-morning, and she heard his voice before she saw him, speaking to Harold at the front counter about flour and nails and 1 or 2 other items. She kept her eyes on her sewing for a full 2 minutes, which was a victory of self-discipline, and then Harold called back to her. "Esther, you've got a visitor." She looked up. Perry was standing a few steps away from her sewing corner, hat in his hands in exactly the way she remembered, wearing a clean shirt and a vest over his canvas pants. He looked, in the light of the store window, cleaner and slightly less sun-dark than she remembered, and his gray-green eyes found hers immediately. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Perry," she said, and set her sewing down. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes in the back of the store, which was partly screened from Harold's view by a shelf of canned goods, Not that Harold was paying attention. He was ostentatiously reorganizing his stock of tobacco at the other end of the store. Perry asked how she was settling in. She told him about the alterations work and her plan to make up a display dress to show what she could do. He told her about a difficult calving he'd been managing, 3 days without much sleep before the heifer finally cooperated. "You seem to go without sleep fairly regularly," she observed. "Part of the work," he said simply. Then he looked at her and something in his expression shifted, became more direct. It was worth it both times. The warmth in her chest was back, entirely without her permission. "You don't have to say that," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean," he replied, and that was true enough that she believed it without question. He bought his supplies, tied them to Solomon's saddlebag, and came back to say goodbye. He stood on the porch of the general store with his hat on, Solomon tied to the rail, and asked if she would like to take a walk that Sunday after the church service. "A walk," she said, the word light in her mouth. "Just a walk," he said. "Millhaven has a creek about half a mile east of town. There are cottonwoods. It's pleasant." She thought about the cottonwood tree under which she had buried Thomas, and the thought was gentle rather than painful, which surprised her. "A walk would be very nice," she said. He nodded, touched his hat and rode away, and she went back into the store and sat down at her sewing table and stared at the fabric in her hands for a full minute before Grace, who had been in the store the entire time making a great show of examining bolts of calico, materialized beside her and said, "I told you so." "You told me nothing," Esther said. "I told you everything," Grace said with deep satisfaction. "Do you have anything nice to wear on Sunday?" The Sunday walk was the first of many. Perry Easton was not a man who rushed things. He was deliberate in the way of someone who has learned that things done too fast often have to be undone, and there was something in the pace of his courtship that suited Esther deeply, though she could not have said exactly why except that it felt honest. It did not feel like performance or urgency. It felt like intention. They walked the creek that first Sunday, and he told her more about his family, and she told him more about hers, and they discovered that they had both grown up loving books, and that both of them carried a volume in their saddlebag or their wagon, which was perhaps more significant than it sounds in 1878 in the Arizona Territory, where books were not always easy to come by. He had a worn copy of a collected Shakespeare he had carried for years. She had Jane Austen's Emma, which had been her mother's, and which she had read so many times the binding was held together with a piece of ribbon. "I would not have taken you for a Shakespeare man," she said. "Why not?" He asked with the small smile that she had begun to think of as specifically hers, the one that appeared when she said something that surprised him pleasantly. "You seem very economical with words," she said. "Shakespeare is not. Neither is the man I am when I have reason to talk," he said quietly, and looked at the creek rather than at her, which was how she knew he meant something by it. The weeks settled into a pattern that felt, increasingly, less like settling in and more like belonging. She worked in the store and at her sewing, and her business grew. She was a skilled seamstress, and word spread in the way it does in small towns, carried on the back of whoever had recently had a garment made or repaired and was pleased with the result. By the end of her second month in Millhaven, she had more work than she could comfortably finish in a week, and Harold suggested she take on the room at the back of the store as a proper dressmaking workshop, which she did. She was beginning to understand Millhaven as a place. It was not a rich town, and it was not without its troubles. There was a saloon that generated the usual kinds of late-night difficulties, and there was ongoing tension between the ranching community and some of the newcomers who were trying to run farms on land that had been range for years. There was a small Apache family, husband and wife and 3 children, who lived at the edge of town, and who were regarded with varying levels of hostility by various residents, a situation that troubled Esther, and that she discussed with Perry one Sunday afternoon at the creek. "They're not treated fairly," she said plainly. "No," Perry agreed equally plainly. "They're not." He picked up a flat stone and considered it. Most of what's been done to the Apache in this territory is an injustice that doesn't have a comfortable way to look at it. Do you try to look at it? She asked. Yes, he said. It doesn't always make me popular with some of the men I ride with. But you do it anyway. I'd rather be right than popular, he said. She looked at him, this steady, sun-darkened man with his Shakespeare and his spare wheel spoke and his gray-green eyes that went to the heart of things, and she thought, I am in very serious trouble. She did not say it. She was not ready yet. October came, and the desert cooled into the beautiful weather that Esther had learned to think of as Arizona's finest season, when the days were warm without being brutal, and the nights were cool, and the light had that particular quality of gold that made everything look like a painting of itself. There was a dance held at the Millhaven Town Hall on the second Saturday of October, which was the sort of community event that everyone attended, or nearly everyone, and which Grace Holloway had been talking about with barely contained excitement for 2 weeks prior. You should ask Esther to the dance, Grace told Perry, in Esther's presence, with absolutely no shame whatsoever. Perry looked at Grace with the expression of a man who has decided that the most dignified response is no response at all. Then he looked at Esther. Would you like to go to the dance with me? He asked. I would, Esther said, and did not look at Grace, because she knew the look that was on Grace's face, and she was not going to give her the satisfaction. The dance was everything an October dance in a small Arizona territory town should be. The hall was lit with lanterns. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had a banjo, and the music was enthusiastic if not always precisely accurate. There were families with children and old ranchers and young cowboys and everyone in between, and the whole thing smelled pleasantly of sawdust and beeswax, and a general air of people deciding to have a good time. Perry danced with her. She had not been sure he would. He seemed like a man who might stand at the edge of such things and observe them from a safe distance. But he asked her onto the floor for the first dance with the same quiet directness he brought to everything, and he danced properly and well, which surprised her. You can dance, she said. My mother taught me, he said. She said it was a social responsibility. She sounds like someone I would have liked very much, Esther said. Perry smiled, a fuller smile than usual, not quite the small one but a larger, warmer thing. She would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for pretense. And you think I have none. I think you have none, he said. I find it one of the most refreshing things about you. They danced 3 dances together, which in 1878 in a small town was enough to be noticed, and was in fact noticed by everyone including the minister's wife, who made a small approving sound at Grace Holloway. And then they sat together along the wall and talked and watched the other dancers. And at some point during the evening Perry's hand found hers where it rested in her lap, and he held it quietly, and she let him. And neither of them mentioned it, but it was the most significant thing that had happened since the cracked wagon wheel on the desert road 2 months ago. She walked home with him that night, the short walk from the town hall to Harold's general store in the cool dark, and they stood on the porch with the stars overhead, which were as extravagant as always, and she turned to him and he was already looking at her, and he said, Esther, in that careful way he had of saying her name. Yes, she said simply, because she knew what the question was going to be and she was done pretending she did not. He kissed her very gently, one hand coming up to her face, his thumb warm against her cheekbone, and it was not a long kiss but it was thorough and honest, like everything else about him. And when he stepped back he looked at her with an expression that was both composed and entirely undone, which she found achingly moving. I've been wanting to do that since somewhere around midnight on the desert road, he said quietly. I know, she said. You know. You kept putting more wood on the fire than was strictly necessary, she said. You were staying close. He stared at her for a moment and then laughed. A real laugh, low and warm. The first time she had heard him laugh that fully, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. November was cold at nights and warm in the days, and Perry came to Millhaven every Saturday and most Sundays, and sometimes midweek if something brought him to town. He had spoken to Harold briefly and directly because that was his way about his intentions toward Esther, which Harold had received with enthusiasm and related to Esther with only slightly less enthusiasm. "He spoke to me formally," Harold told her, beaming. "Perry does things properly," Esther said. "He does," Harold agreed. "Good man." Tom would have liked him. Esther thought about this. "Yes," she said, "I think he would." The thing about grief, she had found, was that it did not require you to stop living in order to honor it. Thomas had been her husband, and she had loved him in the way of young people who marry and build something together and are simply not given enough time. Perry was different, and she was different, and the love that was growing between them was different too, not better or worse, just different in the way that the same person is different at 26 than at 22. More sure of herself, less willing to pretend, more ready to know what she wanted and say so. What she wanted was Perry Easton. She told him so on a cold Sunday afternoon in November at the creek under the cottonwoods, where the leaves had gone gold and were falling in slow spirals to the dry grass. He had been talking about the ranch, about whether he might eventually try to have land of his own, a small spread north of Millhaven, where he had been eyeing a piece of land for 2 years. He spoke about it tentatively, the way he spoke about anything that mattered to him very much, with careful words and none of the bluster that some men used to hide how much they cared about something. She put her hand on his arm and he stopped talking. "Perry," she said, "I want you to know something." He looked at her steadily. "I am not a woman who is good at pretending things are less than what they are," she said. "You know that about me." "I do," he said. "So I am going to tell you plainly that I am very much in love with you," she said. "And I believe you are in love with me, and I think we should stop circling around it and just acknowledge it directly." For a moment he was completely still, the way he went still when something hit close. Then he reached up and took her hand from his arm and held it in both of his, and his grip was warm and solid and real. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you offered to share your salt pork with a stranger on a dark road and then gave me that look that said you were perfectly capable of handling yourself and were allowing me to help as a courtesy rather than a necessity." She blinked. "That was within the first hour." "Yes," he said simply, "that was within the first hour." She looked at him, this extraordinary man who had sat up all night mending her wheel, and carried a spare spoke in memory of his mother and danced well because she taught him it was a social responsibility, and said things like that was within the first hour without apparent embarrassment because he did not believe in pretending things were less than what they were. "Well," she said, "I believe I knew somewhere around 3 in the morning, when I woke up and found the blanket." He looked at the creek. "I didn't want to wake you," he said. "You were cold." "Perry," she said. "Esther," he said, and looked back at her. "Are you going to ask me?" she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I was planning to ask you properly with a ring, which I don't have yet because I've been saving, and I was going to wait until Christmas." "It is not Christmas," she agreed, "but I am telling you now so that you know what the answer is going to be when you do ask properly with a ring." He studied her face for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that went through things rather than around them, and then he smiled the full smile, the warm one, and it reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there. "Well," he said, "that simplifies my planning considerably." She laughed, and he pulled her toward him and held her, there under the falling cottonwood leaves with the cold November creek running nearby, and it was the most at home she had felt in years, perhaps ever. Perry Easton proposed properly on the 22nd of December, 1878, on the porch of Harold Ellsworth's general store at sunset, with a gold ring set with a small turquoise stone that he had bought from a silversmith in Tucson on a trip he had made specifically, and without telling her why. The ring was unusual and beautiful. The turquoise, a deep clear blue-green that was the exact color of the Arizona sky at the point of the day between afternoon and evening. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the last of the day's light and said, "It's the color of your eyes." He looked startled. "It's the color of the sky," he said. "Yes," she said, "and your eyes." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to know best, the one that was not composed and not undone, but genuinely both at once. And then he kissed her on the porch of the general store at Sunset and Herald, who had watched the whole thing from the window while pretending to write inventory, made a small sound of triumphant satisfaction, and went back to his ledger. They were married on the 14th of February, 1879, in the small white church at the end of Millhaven's Main Street, in a ceremony performed by the Reverend Marcus Allgood, who was a compact, serious man with excellent diction who read the words as if he meant them, which Perry had told Esther he specifically appreciated. Grace Holloway was Esther's attendant, in a state of barely contained emotional satisfaction that expressed itself periodically as dramatic sighing and the application of a handkerchief to her eyes. "You're not supposed to cry before the ceremony begins," Esther told her, while Grace helped her pin her hair in the small room off the vestibule. "I cry when I want to," Grace said firmly, and applied the handkerchief again. Perry's brother James had ridden up from the south for the occasion, a broad-shouldered man with Perry's coloring and a wider grin, and Perry's father had made the trip down from Prescott, a lean, weathered man of about 60 who looked at Esther with the careful assessment of someone who loved his son and took that seriously, and who, within about 20 minutes of talking to her, had decided she was exactly right. "He's not an easy man to know quickly," his father, whose name was Samuel Easton, told Esther before the ceremony while Perry was out of earshot. "No," Esther agreed, "but he is worth the knowing." Samuel Easton looked at her with gray-green eyes that were the older version of his son's, and something in them settled and went warm. "Yes," he said, "he is." And then with great simplicity he said, "Welcome, daughter," and shook her hand. The ceremony was exactly what it should have been. Perry stood at the altar in a dark coat she had not seen before, clearly new, and his father had clearly also told him a thing or two about her worth, because he looked at her, as she came down the aisle with a directness and an openness that she held onto through all the years that followed, the memory of his face in that moment, as clear and present as a man's face could be. They said the words, and the Reverend Allgood said the words, and Perry put a plain gold band on her finger beside the turquoise ring, and she put a plain gold band on his finger, and he held her hand for a moment after, looking down at it. And she knew he was doing what she was doing, simply marking the fact of it, making it real. He kissed her in the church, and Grace Holloway made a sound that was half sob and half cheer, and Dan Holloway, the blacksmith, put his arm around his wife and grinned. The reception was held in the town hall, the same room where they had danced in October, and someone had decorated it with dried wildflowers and pine boughs, and the fiddle and banjo were back, and there was a supper laid out that was quite remarkable for the generosity of a small town toward two of its members. The Apache family, whose name was Running Waiter, had brought a gift of a beautifully made basket, and when Esther opened it and saw the craftsmanship, she sought out the wife, a quiet woman named Mary Running Waiter, who had married a white trader years before, and thanked her directly and warmly. Mary Running Waiter looked at her with dark eyes that assessed and then approved, and said simply, "You are a good woman," and Esther felt this as one of the finer compliments of the day. Perry danced with her 3 times again, as he had at the October dance, and then he stopped dancing with her after the 3rd one because he was talking to his brother and his father and was laughing, really laughing, in the open way she had heard a few times and always wanted to hear again, and she stood with Grace and watched him and felt, in the most uncomplicated way possible, that she was entirely happy. They had a small house. Perry had found it, a modest but solid timber frame place on the eastern edge of Millhaven, with a good well and a garden patch, and a barn large enough for 2 horses and the mule. He had been fixing it up for a month before the wedding, and when he brought her to it the morning after the ceremony, she stood on the porch and looked out at the desert stretching away toward the Red Rock ridges, and felt the expansive, clear satisfaction of arriving at a place she had not known she was looking for. "It's good," she said. "It needs work," he said. "The kitchen garden is a disaster and the barn needs a new roof section come spring." "It's good," she said again and looked at him. "Perry." "It is good." He looked at her and the steadiness in his eyes was absolute. "Yes," he said, "it is." She kept the dressmaking workshop at the store because the work was good and she liked having a thing that was entirely hers, and Perry understood this without needing to be explained to, which was one of the many things she loved about him. He rode out to the Harlan Ranch 3 days a week and sometimes more during calving season or when there was trouble, but he was home most evenings, and when he came home fully, present and attentive, not the kind of man who was there in body and somewhere else entirely in his head. They argued sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, and seriously when they did, because they were both people who took things seriously. There was a period in the summer of 1879 when Perry was offered a job as a full ranch manager for a larger operation down near the Mexican border, and he wanted to take it. And Esther's workshop was doing better than it had ever done, and she did not want to leave Millhaven. And they had 3 days of difficult conversation about it that were real and uncomfortable, and required both of them to listen hard to what the other was saying beneath the words. In the end, Perry turned down the job. He told her it was because the Millhaven land he had been saving for had finally come up for sale and he had a better plan. She asked him directly whether he was turning it down only for her sake because she would not have that, would not have him building a resentment on top of a sacrifice. He looked at her for a long time. "If you left Millhaven, I would have left with you," he said. "But I don't want to leave Millhaven. I want the land north of town. I want to build something here. That's not only for your sake, it's for mine." She believed him, because she had learned to read him well enough by then to know when he was being completely honest and when he was managing the truth out of consideration, and this was the completely honest version. He bought the land in October of 1879, 80 acres of good grass north of town with a creek crossing it and a stand of cottonwoods at the eastern edge, and they rode out together on a Sunday afternoon to look at it, and he walked the whole of it with her, telling her what he saw when he looked at it, not what was there but what could be there, and she listened to his vision with the particular quality of attention she gave to the things he cared about most. There was a rise at the north end of the property from which you could see a very long way. They stood on it in the October afternoon light, the desert and the ridges spread out around them, and Perry stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and neither of them said anything for a while. "We could put the house there," he said eventually, gesturing toward a spot where the ground leveled out below the rise, sheltered by a slight incline from the north wind. "With a porch facing east," she said. For the morning light, he looked at her. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She was expecting their first child by November of 1879, a fact she told Perry on a Sunday evening when they were sitting by the fire in their house in Millhaven. And she told him simply and directly, as she told him everything, and watched his face go through something she had never quite seen on it before, a kind of profound undoing followed by a joy that was too large for his usual composure to contain. And he sat forward in his chair and took both her hands and held them and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Esther." "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he asked immediately, practically. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I've been well for 2 months. I wanted to be certain before I told you." He looked at their joined hands for a moment, and she could see him taking stock of things, the practical man in him already running through the list of preparations and considerations. But underneath that was the joy still visible, still present. "A child," he said quietly. "Likely by June," she said. He looked up at her. "We need to start on the house," he said. "That's what you're thinking about," she said. "I'm thinking about many things," he said. "But the house is the practical one I can do something about immediately." He paused. "What are you thinking about?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm thinking that my mother would have been so happy," she said. He came around the table and sat beside her and put his arm around her and held her, and she leaned into him. And they sat that way for a long time with the fire and the dark November outside the windows. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was not an easy one for the territory. There were reports of trouble along the southern routes, tension with renegade bands that the army was poorly equipped to manage, and the newspapers poorly qualified to explain. And there was a hard freeze in January that killed cattle across 3 counties and made the already difficult conditions for the small ranchers and farmers genuinely desperate. Perry spent considerable time during those months working with the Harlan outfit to manage their losses, and also helping some of the smaller homesteaders who had less buffer against the cold. There was a family named Reedy, husband and wife and 4 children, who had come from Arkansas the previous spring and set up a small farm on land that turned out to be harder to work than they had anticipated, and the freeze had taken their remaining livestock and left them in a very difficult position. Perry organized a collection among the ranching community and bought them 2 replacement animals from his own wages without telling anyone but Esther about the second part. She found out from Grace Holloway, who had found out from Dan, who had found out from somewhere in the chain of information that small towns run on. "You didn't tell me," she said to Perry that evening. "You would have insisted on contributing and were saving for the house," he said. "Perry, Esther." They looked at each other. "You are a genuinely good man," she said. He looked at the fire, discomfited in the way he always was when she said something that reached past his composure. "They had children," he said simply. "Yes," she said. "I know, that's what makes you a good man." He looked at her then fully, and reached across the table and put his hand on hers, and she turned her hand over and held his. The house on the North Land was begun in March, when the ground softened enough to work. Perry had arranged with a local builder named Calhoun, a quiet and skilled man who had put up half the town's structures, to lead the construction, and Perry worked alongside him every day he was not at the ranch, which given the calving season meant some very long days. Esther came out to the building site most Saturdays, and sometimes brought lunch and spent the afternoon watching the structure take shape. There was something deeply satisfying about watching a house grow, she found. The frame going up, the walls taking shape, the spaces becoming rooms with dimension and purpose. Perry had asked her opinion on every decision that was not purely structural: the size of the kitchen, the placement of the windows, the layout of the rooms. He asked not as a formality but genuinely, wanting to know what she thought, incorporating her answers into the plans with the same seriousness he brought to the structural questions. "You're doing it again," she told him one Saturday afternoon. "What am I doing?" he asked, looking up from a consultation with Calhoun about the roof pitch. "Listening to me," she said. He looked at her as though he was not entirely sure why this required comment. "You know what you're talking about," he said, "and it's your house." "Our house," she said. "Our house," he agreed simply and completely. Their son was born on the 8th of June, 1880, in the house in Millhaven, attended by the doctor and Grace Holloway, who had appointed herself essential and was entirely correct about that. Perry was there, because he had stated calmly and without argument that he was going to be there, and that this was not a negotiable point. And the doctor, a man named Hargrove who had seen most things, decided after one look at Perry's expression that this particular point of dispute was not worth the effort. The birth was difficult in the normal way of births, long and hard and requiring more courage than Esther had generally needed for anything else, and Perry was beside her through most of it, steady and present, holding her hand when she wanted it and staying out of the way when she needed him to, and talking to her in his low, quiet voice about nothing important. Just talking, keeping her tethered to something calm. The boy was dark-haired and loud and entirely himself from the first moment, and Perry held him with the careful, awed attention of a man who is encountering something for the first time that he has no framework for, and is therefore taking it very seriously. "Samuel," Esther said. "After your father." Perry looked at her over the baby's head, and his eyes were bright in a way she had never seen them bright before, and she felt her own throat tighten. "Samuel," he agreed quietly. Samuel Easton had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and both of their capacity for focus. And he was the primary occupation of their lives for the months that followed, in the way that a new child is, all-consuming and entirely unreasonable, and more wonderful than anything they had been adequately prepared for. They moved into the North Land house in September of 1880, when Samuel was 3 months old, and the house was finished to the point of being fully livable if not entirely decorated. It stood on the spot Perry had chosen, with the porch facing east exactly as they had discussed, and on the first morning they woke there, Esther carried Samuel to the porch in the early light, and Perry came and stood beside her, and they watched the sun come up over the red rock ridges, the three of them in the golden light, and it was the exact thing. Perry left the Harlan Ranch at the end of 1880 and began working his own land full-time. It was a beginning, not a full operation, just a small herd of cattle and the 80 acres, but it was his, and he worked it with the same methodical dedication he brought to everything. He was not a man who expected things to be easy or who was discouraged when they were not. Esther kept her workshop at Harold's store for another 2 years, until Samuel was old enough to come with her reliably, and until the work had grown to the point where she could justify setting up a proper dressmaking room in the house, which she did in 1882 in the large room at the back that faced south and had the best light. Harold had retired by then, turning the store over to a nephew who had come from back east and needed some months to learn the way of things. Harold himself spent his retirement in cheerful contentment, visiting Esther and Perry and Samuel regularly, and declaring frequently that the Arizona Territory was the finest place a man could grow old in. The territory continued to change around them. The railroads were coming closer every year, and with them came people and commerce and the particular energy of a place that is becoming something different. The Apache conflicts continued in the southern parts of the territory, brutal and complex, and deeply unjust in ways that required no great intelligence to see, only the willingness to look. Perry and Esther talked about these things as they talked about everything, directly and without pretense. Perry had developed a cordial and genuine friendship with James Runningwater, the man in the Apache family that had been at the edge of town since before Esther arrived. A friendship built on mutual respect and practical cooperation, and the kind of plain speaking that Perry practiced with everyone. When things were difficult in town for the Runningwater family, Perry made his own position clear without drama, simply by acting consistently and refusing to pretend that the injustice was not happening. Esther, for her own part, had spent considerable time with Mary Runningwater, and had on 2 occasions quietly intervened when women in town had been unkind to Mary in ways that were mean-spirited and small. She had not made speeches about it. She had simply made her position clear, as she made all positions clear, by being plain and direct and very difficult to dismiss. In the spring of 1882, Perry's cattle operation had grown enough that he could hire 2 hands, and he did, carefully selecting men whose work ethic and character met his standards, which were high. By 1883, he had 120 head of cattle and had bought an adjacent 40 acres when it came available, bringing the property to 120 acres of good grass with reliable water. Samuel grew up alongside the ranch and the workshop, a serious child who asked excellent questions and had a remarkable capacity for sitting still and watching things that interested him, which covered a wide range of topics from the cattle in the field to his mother's sewing to the way his father fixed things. He was 5 years old when Esther's second pregnancy was confirmed, and he received this information with the gravity of someone processing a complex logistical change. "Will there be room?" he asked his father with genuine analytical concern. "Plenty of room," Perry said. "The house is not very large," Samuel pointed out. "We'll build on," Perry said. Samuel thought about this carefully. "All right," he said, accepting it as resolved, and went back to whatever he had been doing. Perry met Esther's eyes over Samuel's head, and the small smile was there, warm and private, and she returned it. The second child, born in November of 1883, was a girl, and she came into the world with a completeness and a certainty about herself that was fully apparent from the first hour. She had Esther's coloring, brown hair and darker eyes, and her father's stillness when she was interested in something, which was constantly, and from the first week she made it entirely clear that she had opinions. They named her Ruth, after no one in particular except that the name seemed to belong to her, and Samuel, after a few days of cautious assessment, decided that he approved of his sister and took on the role of informing her about how things worked with a thoroughness that Perry found both deeply amusing and entirely recognizable. "He does that," Esther told Perry, watching Samuel show the week-old Ruth the workings of the lamp on the bedside table with great seriousness. "Does what?" "Explains things to people, like you do." Perry looked at his son with the complex expression of a man seeing himself in someone else for the first time. "I'm not sure I do that," he said. "Perry," Esther said. "All right," he said. "I do that." She laughed, and he put his arm around her, and they watched their son explain to his infant sister the complete mechanics of a kerosene lamp, and it was one of the finest moments of either of their lives. The addition to the house was built in the spring of 1884, 2 new rooms off the back, and a covered section of porch that wrapped around the eastern and southern sides of the house. Perry designed it himself with Calhoun's structural input, and Esther had opinions about every interior detail, which Perry solicited and incorporated, and the result was exactly what it should be, a house that had grown to fit the family living in it. The years from 1884 to 1888 were, in the way of good years, full without being dramatic. The ranch grew steadily. Perry was known throughout the territory as a fair and competent cattleman whose word was reliable and whose management of his land was careful. He was asked periodically to serve in various civic roles: the town council, a committee regarding water rights, a role in organizing the annual county fair, and he took on the ones that seemed genuinely useful and declined the ones that were more about prominence than purpose, which was characteristic. Esther's dressmaking had become by 1885 something substantially more than a side enterprise. She employed 2 women from town, one of them Mary Runningwaiter, who had a gift for beadwork and embroidery that was extraordinary, and the workshop in the south room of the house had expanded into the barn's attached storage room, which Perry had converted for the purpose with the same care he brought to any construction. She had developed a particular specialty in wedding dresses, which seemed to come to her naturally, perhaps because she thought about them in terms of what they needed to be for the woman wearing them rather than what was fashionable in the Eastern papers that sometimes made their way to Millhaven. Women traveled from 2 counties away for her wedding dresses, and she had made 11 of them by the time she made her 12th, which was for Grace Holloway's eldest daughter Marion, who was marrying the son of a rancher from north of town in the spring of 1886. Grace wept through the entire fitting process. "Grace," Esther said, pinning the hem with pins held carefully in her mouth, "if you keep crying, you'll shake her shoulders and she'll move and I'll stick myself." "I can't help it," Grace said wetly. "She's my daughter. She's getting married, not leaving the territory," Esther said. "It feels the same," Grace said. Esther sat back on her heels and looked at Grace, and the look was gentle because this was Grace, who had been her friend from the very beginning, and she said, "No, it does not. I promise you it does not." Grace wiped her eyes and looked at Esther with the directness they had always used with each other. "You are absolutely right," she said. "Thank you." "Always," Esther said, and went back to the hem. Perry's father Samuel came to visit most summers from Prescott, and his relationship with both Esther and the children was one of the finest things in Perry's life, she thought. The old man was easier with her children than he had been with his own, the common grace of grandparenthood, and he and young Samuel had a particular bond built on long conversations about the natural world, in which both of them had serious intellectual investment. James Easton, Perry's brother, came less often but wrote letters regularly, long rambling accounts of his cattle operation near the Mexican border that were full of the kind of comic self-deprecation that Perry's own letters entirely lacked. Perry read them aloud at the dinner table, and they all laughed, even Ruth, who was too young to understand the specifics, but understood perfectly well when something was funny. In the spring of 1887, Millhaven got a telegraph office, which connected them more directly to the wider world, and by 1888 the railroad spur from the main line was close enough that regular mail service had improved dramatically. The territory was approaching statehood in the conversations that everyone was having, and with it came the mixed feelings of a place that had formed its identity partly around being beyond the reach of Eastern institutions, and was not entirely comfortable with the idea of being incorporated into them. Perry had thoughts about statehood that were characteristically practical. He was in favor of the legal protections it would bring for land rights and water rights, and for the people who lived and worked in the territory, and he was aware that it would change things and not all the changes would be improvements. He said this to Esther one evening over supper, laying out the considerations carefully. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked. He looked at her. "My gut says it's coming regardless of what any of us think about it," he said. "So the question is what we do with it when it gets here." "Yes," she said, "that's always the question." Samuel, who was 8 and sat at the table with the attentiveness of a child who understood that this was the sort of conversation worth listening to, asked, "What does statehood mean for the Apache?" Perry and Esther both looked at him. "That," Perry said carefully, "is the most important question about it, and I don't have a good answer. I hope it means protection under better laws. I'm afraid it might mean more of what they've already been subjected to. What made you think of that?" "James Runningwaiter told me about the reservation," Samuel said. "He doesn't like it." Perry held his son's gaze. "No," he said, "he doesn't, and he's right not to." Samuel considered this. "Then what can we do?" he asked. Perry looked at Esther briefly, and something passed between them that was recognition of exactly the kind of human they had produced. Then he looked at his son. "We do what we can," he said. "We treat people fairly. We speak up when we see injustice. We don't look away because it's easier. It's not enough, but it's not nothing." Samuel thought about this seriously and then nodded, satisfied with the answer in the way of children who ask real questions and are given real answers. The late 1880s brought a drought to the territory that was hard on the cattle operations and harder on the smaller farms. Perry managed the ranch through it with the careful resource management that was his particular strength, drilling a second well in 1888 that turned out to be critical by 1889, when the first summer without adequate rainfall hit, and the creek on the eastern edge of the property dropped to a fraction of its usual flow. He helped several neighboring operations manage the dry period, sharing water access from his second well with 2 adjacent properties whose owners could not have survived the summer without it. He did not do this for credit or payment and declined when both men offered either. "You'll do the same if the situation reverses," he said simply. Both men kept their word when circumstances allowed, which Perry had expected, because he knew the people around him well enough to know who would. The drought broke in the fall of 1889, dramatically, in a series of rains that came from the south and turned the desert creek back to a proper creek and brought the grass back with a speed that always surprised Esther. The way the desert could look dead for months and then produce color and life within 2 weeks of good water. She was 37 in 1889, and Perry was 41. And they were the kind of married that is built on years of honest knowing rather than the early fire of new feeling, which Esther found was not less but more, a larger and more durable thing than she had known how to imagine when she was young. She still looked at him across a room and felt it, the particular quality of warmth and recognition that was not familiarity in the deadening sense but familiarity in the sense of knowing something completely and finding it entirely worth knowing. He still put wood on the fire when she was cold. He still listened to her in the way that meant he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He still said her name when he needed to say something important in that careful way, the way that meant he was choosing his words and she was worth choosing them for. She told him one evening in 1889, sitting on the east porch in the last of the day's warmth, that she thought about the night on the desert road still. Still, he said. Often, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening horizon. "What do you think about?" he asked. "The sound of you working," she said. "It was very late and the desert was very quiet and I could hear you working on the wheel. Just the steady sound of it, and I remember thinking even then that something was happening, that I should pay attention." He turned to look at her. "I thought about walking away," he said. She blinked. "What? Not from you," he said. "From the situation, not because I wanted to, because I thought a woman alone on a dark road, the last thing she needs is a strange man insisting on helping her." He paused. "I stayed because you told me your name." "I told you my name," she repeated. "Yes. You'd set the rifle down and you told me your name, and I thought, she's decided to trust this. The least I can do is be worthy of it." He looked at her steadily. "So I stayed." Esther looked at her husband in the evening light, this man who had made her life into something she would choose again without a moment's hesitation, who had sat up all night on a dark desert road because leaving someone stranded was not acceptable to him, who had raised a son that asked the most important questions and a daughter who would almost certainly run the world when she was old enough to get to it. "I'm very glad you stayed," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The last decade of the century brought the changes that had been building for years. Arizona Territory moved closer to statehood, though that formal recognition would not come until 1912. The railroad reached Millhaven in 1891, which changed the town's character in ways both welcome and complicated, bringing more people and more commerce and more of everything, good and difficult alike. Samuel, at 12, was a boy who looked exactly like a taller, leaner version of his father and thought exactly like his mother, a combination that made him formidable in debates and effective in practice. He had decided he was going to study law, which he had announced to his parents at age 11 with a directness that was entirely characteristic. Perry had listened to the full explanation and then said simply, "Good. Where?" "Tucson, eventually," Samuel said. "There's a proper school now." "All right," Perry said. "We'll plan for it." Ruth, 2 years younger, was a girl who had already demonstrated a facility for running any enterprise she set her mind to, and a complete absence of willingness to be told what she could or could not do on account of being a girl. She managed the dressmaking workshop with Esther from the age of 8 onward, not as a child playing but as a genuine apprentice with opinions and an eye for proportion and color that was, frankly, better than Esther's own in certain respects. "She's going to be better at this than I am," Esther told Perry. "Yes," he agreed, without any apparent distress about this fact. "You're not supposed to just agree immediately," she said. "Why not? It's true." He looked at her. "You're smiling." "I'm very proud of her," Esther said. "I know," he said. "So am I." The house expanded one more time in 1892, adding a full second story with 2 rooms above the original structure, which Perry and Calhoun built together over the course of a summer, and which Esther decorated with the particular care and confident eye that was hers. The house was, by any measure, a good house, solid and warm and lived in with the full occupation quality of a place where people actually lived their lives rather than existing in space. There was a third child, a boy born in 1891, and they named him Thomas, which Esther proposed and Perry accepted with the quiet understanding of a man who knew what was meant by it and honored it. Thomas Easton was an entirely different creature from his siblings, sunny and physical and interested in everything that could be climbed or ridden or built. and he was the clear inheritor of the ranch in terms of both temperament and passion for the land, which became apparent from approximately the age of 3, when he started following the ranch hands around with absolute determination. Perry found this deeply satisfying, in the private way of a man who has built something and can see it continuing. Esther found it deeply satisfying in the way of a woman watching a man she loves see the thing he hoped for come to pass. By 1895, Perry Easton was 47 years old and was regarded as one of the most respected men in his part of the territory. The ranch was 300 acres now, with a good herd and 2 full-time hands, and a reputation for reliable stock and fair dealing. He sat on the County Water Commission, a role he had taken on because it actually mattered, and he was the person that newcomers and established families alike went to when they needed someone to arbitrate a dispute, because he was known to be both fair and direct. Esther was 43, and the dressmaking workshop had become a genuine institution. She had 3 women working for her regularly, including Mary Runningwaiter, whose beadwork was known across 2 territories, and she had trained 2 younger women who had since set up their own small operations, which she took more pride in than any personal recognition. Samuel had gone to Tucson to study at 17, and was by 1895 a young man of 15 in his studies, heading toward a career in law that was already beginning to look serious and purposeful. He came home for Christmas and the summer, and Perry rode out to meet him on the road into Millhaven every single time without making a particular point of it, just being there when his son came up the road. Esther stood on the east porch and watched this ritual one December evening, Perry on Solomon's replacement, a dark bay called Coppersmith, riding out toward the road as the evening light went red and gold, and Samuel coming up the road from town with his travel bag, and the 2 of them stopping when they saw each other, and then riding together up the long approach to the house. She had Ruth beside her on the porch, and Thomas behind them, both jumping up and down with the particular energy of a 7-year-old who has been waiting for his admired older brother for 3 weeks. And the house was warm behind them, and the smell of supper was in the air, and Perry and Samuel came up the road together in the fading light, talking with the ease of people who know each other completely. She looked at all of it, the land and the house and her family and the man she loved riding toward her in the evening light, and she felt the fullness of it with the same quality of attention she had been paying since that desert night 17 years ago when something had told her to pay attention. She was paying attention. She always had been. Perry came up to the porch and swung down from Coppersmith and handed the reins to Thomas, who took them with the gravity of an official function, and Perry climbed the porch steps and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, the land in the fading light, the cottonwoods along the eastern edge dark against the dimming sky, the stars just beginning to appear overhead. "Good evening, Mrs. Easton," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Easton," she said, leaning slightly against him. His arm came around her shoulders, easy and warm. He smelled of horse and sage and cold air, the way he had smelled that first night on the desert road, and she was briefly, vividly back there, the cracked wheel and the fire and his voice in the dark explaining what he was doing, and then she was here, fully and entirely here. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The night we met," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The wheel," he said. "The wheel," she agreed. "And the blanket." She felt him smile against the top of her head. "I told you I didn't say things I didn't mean," he said. "You did," she said. "You've been proving it ever since." He held her a little closer. Samuel had gone inside with Ruth, and Thomas was leading Coppersmith toward the barn with enormous importance, and the stars were coming out one by one in the Arizona sky, extravagant and bright in the way they had always been. The way they had been on that first night when she sat beside a lantern on a dark road and watched a stranger work with the focused commitment of a man who had decided something was worth doing and was going to do it right. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder, and he turned his hand under hers and held it as he had held it 1,000 times, as he would hold it 1,000 times more. "Perry," she said. "Esther," he said. Inside the house, Thomas could be heard telling his siblings something at length and with great enthusiasm, his voice carrying through the walls with the particular penetrating quality of a 7-year-old who has something important to say. Ruth's response was audible and composed, and very clearly in control of the situation. Samuel's low laugh came through the kitchen window, so like his father's that Esther felt it in her chest. The desert air was cool and clean and smelled of sage, and the faint sweetness of something flowering somewhere in the dark, and the east porch faced the rising moon as it rose over the red rock ridges. And Perry Easton and Esther Ellsworth Easton stood together on the porch of the house they had built on the land they had chosen in the life they had made from a cracked wagon wheel and a dark road, and a man who had decided that leaving someone stranded was simply not acceptable. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, everything.